Hey guys, welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast Coffee Break Sessions, the show where we cover foundational Treasury topics and questions in about the same amount of time it takes you to drink your coffee. Hi everyone, welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast Coffee Break Sessions. This is Alexa, your host, and I'm joined here today with Craig Jeffery, Managing Partner of Strategic Treasurer. Today we're going to be talking about float and what it is. So Craig, what is float?
Float is it's a time delay of some activity for processing, posting, or clearing, usually related to financial matters. So it might be you receive information about a payment before you receive cash or available funds, or you receive available funds perhaps before you can post it. So it's a delay of that activity. So float is inefficient. It's particularly bad in those environments where you have paper items like mail. But it works. The same issue exists in other areas for, let's say, card processing. You may get your data on the card processing sooner than you receive funds for those. So float is a time delay. It could be related to mail, processing, availability, the delay of posting. There's a number of examples where there can be float in the corporate environment.
Okay, I'm trying to think of when I've seen float, and I think I remember seeing it on bank analysis statements. I guess what's impacting float?
Yeah, so on the analysis statements or bank statements, you may see something like available funds and ledger funds. So ledger funds are, what accounting would consider cash. What Treasury and what banking considers cash is a little different. So for an example of on the bank statement, let's say you have a lockbox, for example, and again, this is paper example. You could see that there's a deposit, but those funds may not be available for a day and a half or a day. It used to be a much larger length of time for the whole clearing process or to make those funds available. But you collected $5 million today, maybe $1 million is available immediately, $4 million is available tomorrow, and $1 million is available the day after. So that creates, the accounting might say all of that's available now. From an accounting standpoint, but you can't use those funds for investing or paying down debt.
Okay, that makes sense. And that actually leads right into my next question, which is who really cares about float? And it sounds like, there's different types of float. There's different interpretations of it depending on where you're at, right? If it's the bank ledger or the opening ledger balance. So who cares about this the most?
Yeah, the most is Treasury typically, because if you're an AR person, you want to make sure you can relieve the receivable by the end of the month. That's when it matters to them for what they're measured on. They tend not to care at all if the funds are actually available. They want to make sure that the accounting can be done or posted rapidly. Treasury cares about it because just having it on the balance sheet as cash that qualifies for GAAP cash or your standard cash treatment doesn't mean you can use those funds for investing or paying down debt or using in the business for the cash conversion cycle. So Treasury tends to care about it the most. Sometimes executives care about it when they say, we look like we had all this cash available on our balance sheet, but we didn't have that much money invested. Why weren't we investing those funds? That can be an example of why that matters.
Okay. Another question I have is who's benefiting from it? And it does still sound like it's Treasury, whether it's on the balance sheet with the cash and maybe why it's not invested like you just said, but is there any other benefit that I'm not seeing or hearing right now?
Who benefits from float? There's not a real benefit from having a slower availability of funds for the corporation organization that's receiving them. That's a disadvantage. It might be an advantage of a slow process for the person who's dispersing the funds because maybe funds aren't coming out of their account as rapidly as possible. So float doesn't necessarily have too many benefits maybe on the other side. And in one sense, it used to be a bigger issue when checks were cleared with planes flying across the country. And there were some delays on electronic sides that were on the electronic side of collections. That was a bigger issue. And float would accrue more of a benefit to the banks, largely because they would set a target and offer a certain availability schedule, and they would work to beat it and beat it heavily. so that they could make use of the funds, because they would still offer what they had, and then they would find more and more efficient ways. So the fact that there's float means that people will try to find efficiencies, but it's nice when data and the value of funds transfers at the same time.
Okay. So I guess speaking of the efficiencies, and then you kind of alluded to how float was larger, I guess, before electronic methods of payments were introduced. Like I'm thinking of checks and that sort of thing. Do you think float's going to go away? You know, we have Zelle now, we have Venmo, we have all kinds of more instant payment methods.
Yeah, so on the consumer side, those are definitely taking the time delays out. You have a lot of faster and better payment methods, different schemes across the globe. That is reducing float, and that's quite excellent. So yeah, I think at some point it will all go away. Just like I think eventually checks will go away in the United States. I don't know when. It's a really long time before that will happen, but its importance has definitely diminished in terms, or the scale has diminished. But it's still important. Card processing, people are posting things, they don't have funds, and so there can be a misalignment, depending on how people record things, between GAAP cash or accounting cash and the availability of those funds that you see in the bank accounts.
Okay. Just to recap everything we've sort of covered. I have float as the delay of the activity, and that's kind of like a high-level definition of it. And then float can differ across the different dimensions or areas, kind of like you said. And then it might be going away. But I think that's a very long shot.
Yeah, and our goals as efficient treasury people, whether it's bankers or tech firms or treasury people and organizations, is to make sure that things are efficient, and that means that the data that allows us to book and record things moves quickly and efficiently and can apply to the receivable. Because you can have issues of different types of delays in posting, because you get a payment in, and maybe you don't have enough detail to post and clear on the general ledger. Again, for a receivable example, and so these are key areas to drive efficiency. And so I think your summary is right. And I was thinking it could be a delay, or maybe it's a better definition is float is the mismatch of information used for accounting and the availability of funds. That might be a better definition.
Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Float can differ across a couple different dimensions. One is the liquidity axis, and the other is working capital. So liquidity has to do with availability. That's what we mostly spoke about. That's the time taken to get funds that are usable at the time. The other is the working capital mindset of how do I clear things, on the receivable side, or when I'm issuing payments, how does that impact cash from a GAAP standpoint? So there's a working capital measure, which is important because people look at that. That tends to be point in time or end of the month. And then there's the liquidity, which has to be concerned, which treasury people have to be concerned about at all times. So this mismatch gets solved or resolved as we align those two things, but across those two dimensions of working capital and liquidity.
Okay. Well, thank you, Craig, for walking us through what float is. I appreciate your time. And to all our listeners, tune in every first and third Thursday of the month for a new episode. And if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, shoot us an email at podcast@strategictreasurer.com.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.